I study Korean studies as a major here at Seoul National University. And as you can see, the topic that I chose for my paper is German and South Korean public diplomacy, with a focus on cooperation between public and private sector. I chose specifically German and South Korean public diplomacy because I think that they have many similarities. First of all, Germany and Korea have both faced a division. Germany was divided into East and West, and Korea was divided into South and North. This translated into anxiety and insecurity about the national identity. They were both controlled by foreign powers, for example, the Allied forces in Germany and the constant military presence of American soldiers in Korea. But they have both emerged as economic powerhouses within their respective regions, and they are leaders in the industrial sector. So they're both trying to overcome their past and try to recreate a new image for themselves far from North Korea and the Nazi regime. I have divided my paper into 3 sections. In the introduction, I talk about the collaboration between public and private sector. In the second section, I talk about first the German collaborative diplomacy. I continue with the Korean network diplomacy. And I then explain how these efforts have translated into successful public diplomacy for these nations. In the end, I give my conclusion. In the case of this introduction, I talk about the importance of collaboration of the public and private sector. And I talk about the different benefits for private and public sector. For private, for example, profit, and for the public sector, the possibility of outsourcing their services for the foreign public. I would like to clarify, because I got a suggestion, and it can come off as a public-private partnership, but through my paper I want to show that it is possible to make public diplomacy actions into the private sector's responsibility, and it is also possible to make the private sector practices coherent with the public diplomacy agenda, that it is not PPP, but can be public diplomacy. In the case of the main body, I start with the German collaborative diplomacy. I give a short introduction into the historical background of Germany after 1960, because that is when Germany declared public diplomacy its 3rd pillar of diplomacy. And for the purpose of explaining how Germany shifted from traditional diplomacy to public diplomacy. And I hereby focus on the current status, how Germany uses collaborative diplomacy in the most current European refugee crisis. And I chose, again, this topic because it is not only very recent, but it also shows Germany's foreign policy, as it is a very widespread problem that absolutely needs the help and cooperation of many nations, and of course the domestic and the public sector. So I can show how Germany's government is using the private sector and the foreign public sector alike. So for this case, I specifically focused on the different dimensions the private security companies in Germany work together with the government to secure the borders through which the refugees enter the country. And I also researched to which lengths both the private sector and the public sector went to engage the foreign public, to cooperate with them, to work with them, and how they communicate with each other. I also concluded a short paragraph on the response of different foreign European nations to see how the German policy is perceived in the different countries. In the next chapter, I talk about Korean network diplomacy. Again, I give a short introduction on the historical background starting from the 1950s and after the Korean War to explain the development from traditional to public diplomacy. Here I focus on the network diplomacy, which I associate with the expert of Korean popular culture. And here I try to examine how the Korean government tries to reach the domestic and the foreign public through SNS, social network services like Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and also how they promote the content through the help of private institutions like the King Sejong Institute. So this one is not the updated version apparently, sorry about that. So the King Sejong Institute. I also look at the different levels of communication between the Korean government and the private sectors, but also how the private institutions interact with each other, how they promote their content, how they promote Korean culture and the Korean government, but also other institutions to see how this networking itself works. At the end of each chapter, I like to apply Socheon's four-quadrant classification, because it's not a theory, it's more like a classification, you might say. And she argues that we need a better understanding of our publics, and we need to understand the importance of the relation between the state and the public. So she visualizes this by these four quadrants, and I use this visualization to show that Germany and Korea are respectively, I argue, in the second and the third quadrant. So I explain this in more detail in my paper, but just for your information. I use Socheon's classification as a bridge to my last point in the second section, in which I talk about how German and Korean public diplomacy can be considered successful models by stating the constant promotion of the national image and the establishing of new relations to different countries. And I reasoned by coming back to one of the many public diplomacy definitions, which goes back to the idea of a genuine dialogue. So the genuine dialogue is consisting of credibility, trust, transparency, a symmetrical two-way communication, and obviously mutual interests. Yeah, so in considering these attributes of the genuine dialogue, I argue that both nations, Germany and Korea, are using these attributes and fulfill basically the expectations for this genuine dialogue and are therefore successful in the public diplomacy. In my conclusion, I revisit the important aspects of my paper, in which I try to answer the different questions like, how does Germany's collaborative diplomacy approach make use of the private sector? How do the efforts directly or indirectly encourage other countries to work with them? How is the reaction from foreign countries? In the Korean case, how does the network public diplomacy for Korea help the export of Korean popular culture? How does the different communication networks work together? And how do they influence the overall performance of public diplomacy of Korea? As a last point, I give, as mentioned, reasons why German and Korean public diplomacy could be considered successful, should be considered successful. And for the suggestions for further research, I asked the question if it is possible to adapt German and Korean public diplomacy to other nations. So obviously Korea is a middle power state, and if it is possible to adapt this model Korea uses to other middle power states. And secondly, if there is a possibility for a different approach in the Korean case, such as not cultural public diplomacy, which most of us have talked about today. So these would be my questions for further research. And I based my research paper on these and more, because this is not the updated version, articles and papers. Thank you very much.